I'd like to do today is just give you some background about a little bit about ABPP, and then also talk particularly about the organizational and business consulting specialty. So basically, I'll just give you a quick introduction to ABPP. We'll talk about Oregon business consulting in some depth, benefits, competency areas we look for, and also how you apply, and then make sure that we have enough time for your questions. Also, feel free to contact me after the presentation if something else occurs to you you'd like to hear more about. So very quick background on me. I'm the current board president, worked in human resources for about 10 years. I've been in the consulting business for more than 30, and also worked in psychological test publishing, publishers of the 16PF. Been in academia a couple of years after a previous stint. I'm an applied psychologist in Virginia, and my background is IO psychology. So I'm becoming possibly from a little bit different professional perspective. Most of you probably know that ABPP is a sister organization to the American Psychological Association. Really, it was formed in the late 1940s, partly as a response to what was happening in the field of medicine, where there are a number of different board specialties provided. And what psychologists, especially in health services, were discovering, that it was important to have a similar certification track for people who were going to be working with medical professionals. So that's kind of the genesis of ABPP. And so certification by ABPP in general does several things for you. First of all, it, as you can see on the screen there, it lets you know that, it lets the public know rather, that people have really gone on with their development beyond merely getting licensure. Also certifies that you've gone through appropriate training in your specialty area, as well as proper experience. Have been examined on the competencies by a jury of your peers, and also are committed to continuing education and literature review on the latest methods and techniques. So really very much are interested in making sure you're current in your practice. And then finally, that your practice is one that's conducted in a very competent, very ethical manner. Okay, so looking at the ABPP or ABOCP in particular, and I'll say OBCP because it's a mouthful. Our specialists tend to have a variety of different professional arenas they work in. And so some of them are in consulting firms, some work in the not-for-profit side, some of them are like myself are at universities. Others work as you do, government, military organizations, as well as people who are solo practitioners. The other thing that people oftentimes don't know, if they're not familiar with the specialty, is people who are certified in Oregon business consulting really have a variety of specialty areas. And so there are people who come out of clinical or counseling programs. They may be school psychologists. They could be somebody like me who's an IO psychologist. But in our most recent member survey, a number of the people who are certified in Oregon business consulting are not IO psychologists. So if that's not your background, don't feel that that's a limitation for you. Okay, what we find instead is that many times people start in health services or other areas and then transition into doing organizational consulting. In most cases, what happens is people end up really trying to build their additional knowledge and skills through different avenues like self-education or sponsored training, working with an experienced supervisor, consultation, or some of the other things that you frequently do when you move into the consulting field. Okay, one of the things that we know about the consulting world as compared to health services psychology is the kinds of things that we're typically looking for are a bit different. And so on the clinical side, as I think most of you know very well, many times we're focusing on individual functioning in terms of emotional well-being, self-understanding, personal and relationship functioning, and things of those nature. In contrast, when you get into the consulting world, it's a little different story, because really the primary focus is on people being effective in their individual jobs or as members of work teams or in working in the organization. And so one of the key differences is that people in organizational consulting are focusing most times, first of all, on work performance. So how do they develop skills to perform the proper task and complete their roles? How do they work with coworkers? All of the other kinds of things that occur at an individual, group, or organizational level when people are at work. There's a secondary emphasis on personal functioning, but first of all, it's really about effectiveness on the job. And so one of the key things, as I talk with clinicians about this, is it's important that you understand the organizations you're working with, and also the requirements of the different jobs or teams that people are involved in. And so an important ingredient is not only the kinds of things that we learn as psychologists about assessing individual skills, capabilities, personalities, and so on, but really also understanding the context in which they work, because that's an important part of being an effective consultant. So if we look at the specialty of OBCP, it's one of 14 under the ABPP umbrella. And so what we've tried to do is lay out a number of practice areas that are typical of our individual members. So some people work in industrial or personnel psychology, which is really dedicated primarily to things like designing employee selection systems, putting in different types of mass testing programs, things of that nature, designing performance appraisals. They may well work with individual work teams or with leaders of work teams to provide coaching, development, things of that nature. Sometimes they work with large organizations or major portions of organizations to really try to get an understanding of organizational functioning, and also help clients think about how they go ahead and improve the functioning of the organization, including in some cases working closely with leadership about things like major organization change. In some cases, they're working directly in consultation with other psychologists. They could be working, as you can see, in the occupational health area, or another area that we're finding increasing emphasis in is doing individual coaching. In a military world, which includes some of the members of our board, that it often involves working with leadership and working with what they refer to as command consultation, in helping people in leadership roles think about how they operate today, what they could do to improve their effectiveness, and also really providing help as people work through various challenges they face as leaders. So quick example, I'm working with a healthcare executive these days who is responsible for implementing an organizational change in some of the key roles in the organization, where people are going to be shifting job duties and really moving and working at a very different level. And so part of where we spend our time is helping him think about how does he introduce the change, get people ready for it, evaluate who is ready to make the shift that's necessary, and move on. We also find that an increasing number of folks that come to us are interested based on the work they've learned in national security organizations, in the intelligence business, or working in the military, where oftentimes their duties tend to shift away from the things that are more typical when you begin in any one of those organizations, more clinical or counseling oriented, to things that tend to be more related to the work organization, to leadership, to people's job performance and things of that nature. And then one of the other things that we also look at for certification is some of the individuals who come to us are people who have really evolved in their careers to the point where their primary responsibilities are in managerial or administrative roles. And so one of the things that we're currently working on is improving the process for how do we get a good understanding of how people have taken the things they've learned as psychologists and really applied them to be most effective as a leader. Where many times we have some insights that other people don't, but working in a leadership role is different from some of the other things we do as psychologists, some of the other the services that we provide. So some of the benefits of certification as we see them. First of all, when we're working with organizational decision makers, like other forms of certification in medicine, one of the things that certification helps you do is really confirm with the people you're working with that you really have the proper level of expertise. If you're working in a military or other governmental organization, it's another way of demonstrating your capabilities, as well as recognition by your peers. And I'll talk more about the exam process in a few minutes. It does certify as well that you have additional competencies or higher level of competencies than some other psychologists and consultants. Particularly in the government, having ABPP certification can get you to a higher pay level, which of course is important for all of us. The other thing that pardon me, that is very much true with certification, particularly if you expect to be moving geographically, is in many states, probably a bit over half of them, 29, I believe last time I've checked, you can get certification in that state, use your certification rather in that state to help you transfer your license to a new practice area. So I mentioned as an example, I'm certified in the state of Virginia. My original license was in Ohio, but one of our clients required a psychologist who had a Virginia certification to oversee projects. And so what I was able to do is leverage my certification with ABPP to apply through the State Board of Psychology, and without having go through an exam, have a license granted to me, which happened a few years ago. The other thing for folks in academia is having that level of certification really is a way to demonstrate your level of professionalism to tenure and promotion committees. And so one of the things that the folks that are looking for, say, moving to the associate or full professor role, is it's another way of saying, as a psychologist, you're serious about the profession and you've really devoted quite a bit of time to trying to build your knowledge and skills. So some of the things that we look for from an eligibility standpoint, first of all, the primary route is to really already be licensed somewhere in a jurisdiction that's recognized by APA and or the Canadian Psychological Association. We look for people who have 2 years or more of experience after the internship, specifically working in Oregon business consulting. So some of the activities that I mentioned earlier. And so by experience, what we mean is people who have actually had hands-on exposure to the different things that consultants do. They may have completed additional coursework or continuing education. In a few cases, they've actually gone through retraining. So we've had a couple specialists with backgrounds in clinical or counseling psych who have gone back to school and had additional coursework in things like organizational psychology. And in rare cases, people actually go back and get an additional degree. That's not mandatory. In fact, what happens is many people self-educate and find other ways to really try to build their expertise as consultants, recognizing how important it is to make sure they appreciate and have a full understanding of the best ways to tackle the challenges they face as consultants. Okay, a couple other eligibility options that are available. Those people who have been out in the field for a while, 15-year mark or more after licensure, are also eligible for certification. The difference between the certification I just discussed and this particular level is that we tend to require a little bit less variety in terms of the practice of the individuals demonstrated. Oftentimes, what we discover is people in more senior roles have tended to specialize a bit more than people who were a little bit earlier in their careers. And so when it comes to the exam process, what we expect is people designate 2 specialty areas that they'd like to be examined on. And then the final route to coming to us, and I had a conversation about this last week, is the early entry route, where someone who is currently in grad school or working as an intern or resident, but is not licensed yet, can begin the application process with a central office. And so as long as they're in a designated doctoral program, they can really get things moving before they even accumulate all of the experience and all the licensure they need. And we're finding that's increasing interest to folks who are really thinking a little bit longer range about what their career might hold. So to give you a high-level view of the certification process, and I'm deliberately moving quickly, understanding you've got other commitments, it's basically follows these primary steps. So the first thing you do is to apply through the ABPP central office, where there's some standard kinds of things that you provide in terms of the application, including things like graduate transcripts, letters of reference, other kinds of things that certify that you've had the proper foundational training as a psychologist and experience. What happens then is once your application is processed by the central office and you've met all the necessary requirements, then those credentials are passed on to the individual board. So in our case, we have a couple of people on our board who review applications to make sure they really do fit the kinds of capabilities and competencies that we certify in ABOBCP. Part of what we ask you to do in the exam process is to prepare 1 or more work samples that are specific to the areas that you self-designate. So for instance, you may say that you're an individual who's done a lot of training in your organization. You may do a fair amount of coaching, as well as maybe working on different types of organizational change initiatives. And so what we'd ask you to do is prepare practice samples in all 3 of those areas to really provide an in-depth example of the kind of work you do and the kinds of decisions and you've made, as well as the tools and processes you use to make that happen. What happens is we also assign you a mentor to work through the process because we want to make it as collegial as possible. And that individual is there to not only help you with the mechanics of putting the practice samples together and thinking about the exam, but also get you ready for just the sort of basic step of having to sit through an exam again after having gone through licensing and a few other things. And so we like to think of it as providing both kind of professional support and a little bit of personal support as needed. The exam itself is done with a panel of 3 people. What we do, because of the diversity of folks who come to organizational and business consulting, is we construct a panel trying to have members who mirror the professional background of the person who's sitting for the examination. And so if the individual has a clinical psychology background, for instance, we try to assure that at least one, if not more, members of the committee are themselves clinical psychologists, so they can talk the same language. If the individual specializes in a particular area, we try to have someone who's got a similar background, for instance, somebody in the military, or somebody, for instance, like an exam we did this last fall, who's familiar with doing employee training. The exam itself is face-to-face. It includes going over the individual practice samples and really having the candidate tell their story, where the candidate will ask questions and really make sure they get a good appreciation for how the person practices and how they've approached certain important decisions, as well as sort of what they learned and what the outcomes of their practice is. We also do have a component of the exam that's specifically oriented to professional ethics. What we do, though, with that is we really want to look at people applying their knowledge of ethics rather than the way some state psychology boards will tackle that process, where you're expected to know and be able to regurgitate the code by chapter, verse, and code section number. Instead, what we want to do is see how you put your understanding and your experience with ethical issues to work in tackling different problems that you face as a part of the practice work that you've done. The exam itself is pass-fail. And so what we try to do is to make sure that we have a good conversation with the individual, somewhere oftentimes between, say, 2.5 to maybe 3.5 hours. And so we have a really good, thorough conversation with the person. And then what happens is once the committee makes their decision, then the feedback is passed back to the central office, and the central office contacts the candidate about how they performed. The one wrinkle in this is because central office does the communication, sometimes it may feel as if there's going to be a little bit of a lag. But these days, in the worlds of virtual communication, typically what will happen is one of our committee members will actually contact the central office by email and let them know very soon after the exam how the candidate is done. In the unlikely case that you don't pass the exam, part of ABPP practice is to provide targeted feedback about where the exam didn't quite meet the appropriate standards, so that the individual has a chance to go back and take a look at how they prepared for the exam, think back about how they tackled the exam itself, and where they could build their performance to go ahead and go through re-examination. There's a mandatory time lag, which unfortunately is escaping me at the moment, but there's a certain amount of time, I believe it's 6 months, that have to lapse between exam and re-examination. That's a pretty rare experience in the time that I've been with the board. In most cases, people tend to do pretty well in the first exam, and we try to prepare them so that's exactly what the situation is. So that's been a whirlwind tour, introduction to ABPP, Oregon Business Consulting. In the time we have left, let me answer your questions.
Do you find that folks get board certified in multiple areas?
We do on occasion. Many of the people that come to us for examination, it's their first board certification. But occasionally we will have someone who's been previously certified in another area. And the folks at the central office can give you more detail about how that's typically handled. But it's not something I've seen often in the time I've been on the board. Other question I see up here is talking a little bit more about the early entry option. What the central office has done is really try to make it as convenient as possible for people to begin the application process at the point where they're seriously considering ABPP. And that can be done in stages. So as you begin to think about certification, the next step would be to go to the central office website and go to the appropriate section, the appropriate pages that house that application process, and really begin to line up the different kinds of experiences and education that you've developed so far. The fee for early application is very low. If I remember correctly, it's under $100. And what the central office does is leave that application all open. So once you begin the process, you can go back to it at whatever time is convenient to add additional credentials or other kinds of things, like, for instance, certification that you've had the appropriate supervised experience, or completion of your degree, whatever the case might be. And they'll continue to hold that until the point where you're ready to go through a bona fide application. So we really want to try to make it as easy as possible for people who are considering ABPP to make that happen and do it at a pace that makes sense to them.
I can add a little bit of information. So the early entry option, as was mentioned, comes with a discount for the application fee. So instead of it being $125, which is the standard application fee, it is $25. And essentially, it's someone that is pre-licensure. So it's someone that is either in a graduate program, internship, or postdoctoral supervision experience and has not become licensed yet at the independent level. And then another option is the early career application, which is also discounted. That is $65 compared to $125. And that is someone that is post-licensure and within 10 years of their doctoral degree. So it's within 10 years of postdoc, or 10 years of obtaining the doctoral degree and is licensed. Do you have stats on the number of psychologists who pursue board certification? To my knowledge, it's fluctuating around 5%. Ralph or Sam, do you have any other statistics?
That's the same number I've heard as well. Sam, how about for you?
Yes, that's about what I've heard as well.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Feel free to email us if you have any questions. I'll put up my email address. It was part of the announcement, but I'll put up my email address in chat right now. And I didn't introduce myself. So Leo Caraballo, I am the Early Career Psychologist Trustee for ABAP. So if you have early career psychologist or early entry option questions, please feel free to email me and I can provide you that information.
Very good. And again, also from Oregon Business Consulting, if you have individual questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address should be on the invitation also.